Hey folks, Scott Weingart here, and this is the EMCrit podcast. Today, a Mind of the Resuscitationist episode, but with a guest. We're going to talk about optimal team performance with Dan Dworkis. Dan is the founder of the Emergency Mind Project, and part of that project is the Emergency Mind podcast, which is where I first came across him. And I'm listening to his stuff and I'm saying, ooh, wow, we are on real parallel tracks here. I think the things on his podcast are just brilliant. Picked up his book, The Emergency Mind, Wiring Your Brain for Performance Under Pressure. And this is the book I hand out to interns and say, this is the emergency medicine mindset. Master this. He's also the chief medical officer at the Mission Critical Team Institute. He's a board-certified emergency physician and an assistant professor of EM at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. He did his EM residency at the Harvard Medical School. And in addition to his MD, he holds a PhD in molecular medicine from the Boston University School of Medicine. Dan's work is an incredible example of finding your niche and then going full in on it. I think you're going to love this conversation. Now, the way we actually did it is this is a two-part conversation. We're going to discuss part one here on EMCrit, and then part two is an episode on Dan's podcast, the Emergency Mind podcast. So what you will hear is I interviewed Dan about optimal team performance. And then Dan interviews me on his podcast on what individuals could do to kind of bridge when teams have deficits. And so I think the two work really nicely together. The ideal order would probably be this one and then Dan's. But if you listen to either of them first, I think it would be fine. But what you do definitely want to do is listen to both. So you'll find the links to the episode in the show notes for this episode, or if you just search on any of the podcast players for the Emergency Mind podcast, you will find it. And then I am the most recent episode, the interview Dan did with me. Okay, before we jump into the interview, a quick ad for Reanimate, the Reanimate conference, the best resuscitation ECMO conference in the United States. COVID kind of killed us for a while. We're back. It's the beginning of November in San Diego. It is the course that will take you from zero to being able to put a patient on pump the day you get back. And I say that not just from guessing, I say that from actual experience. In almost every course, we've had a person come, learn ECMO for the first time, go back to their center, and then crash a patient onto ECMO. And I think at this stage of the game, all of the patients that has happened to, they have walked out of the hospital. So we are going to give you in those 2 days enough information to be able to do this on an actual patient in the setting of cardiac arrest or resuscitative ECMO. You'll learn all the skills, all of the fundamental understanding of what the technology is actually doing, and you'll have an incredible time. So come to reanimateconference.com. That's reanimateconference.com, and check it out. Consider coming. Consider bringing a team. All right. Well, speaking of teams, let's get into the interview on optimal team performance with Dan Dworkis. Now, you thought we were getting into that because I just told you we weren't, but I lied, and you know why I'm lying. I'm lying because you're listening to the free version of this podcast, and you're getting the full interview here, all, I think, 46 minutes of it, but you shouldn't be listening to it this way. You shouldn't hear me talking right now. What you should be doing is joining and becoming a full member of EMCrit. Why? Because then you will be getting all of the episodes, all of the additional information, all of the additional podcasts you don't get listening to the free versions, never getting it curtailed. And that will make you the best possible resuscitation doctor, the best person to be taking care of your critically ill patients, whether in the ED, the ICU, or the pre-hospital environment. And if you're listening to this free version, it means you're missing out on some of the information that may lead you to be able to save a life. We are the cutting edge of critical care and resuscitation on EMCrit, and that's where you want to be as well. So if you're listening to this free version, consider coming over to emcrit.org/join and becoming a full member. Okay, now for real, let's get into the show. My friend, I've been waiting to have you on for so long. I don't know why our paths have not crossed before now, because we are playing in the same sandbox. When I look at the topics on Emergency Mind, and then I look at Mind of the Resuscitationist on EMCrit, I'm like, oh my God, this is synergy just waiting to happen. So I'm so very pleased to have you here. I've been listening to your stuff. I didn't quite catch it at the inception, but very soon afterwards, I've read your book. I love the things you do, but the listeners don't know you perhaps as well as I do. So tell people who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. And my name is Dan Dworkis. I run the Emergency Mind Project. And I will start by just like absolute admiration for what you all are doing, right? Like you were a huge influence in me coming up from this. And I'm thrilled to be here digging into this today. But the Emergency Mind Project in general is about trying to figure out how to apply knowledge under pressure as its own thing. That is a skill. It's a skill we can train and get better at. And it's one that we have to approach consciously and with intention. And it started a lot from, honestly, from things not going the way I wanted it to on my end in resuscitations and being like, I have all this stuff rattling around in my skull, but I can't really get it out to the patient where and when I need it to be. So what is that about? What is applying knowledge under pressure about? And there's this parallel track of learning that through emergency medicine and actually also learning that through martial arts, right? Where you know a particular move and then you try to apply that particular move in real life. And wow, is that different? Which usually involves getting punched in the face repeatedly until you can figure it out a little better. But yeah, so that's what the Emergency Mind Project is about. It's trying to figure out the best of what anybody knows about how individuals, teams, and organizations apply knowledge under pressure.
That's fantastic lead into what we're going to talk about. And there's so many topics we could have chosen, but I think we've revolved around the dichotomy of individual reliant performance and team reliant performance. And so much of what you do, Dan, and you haven't also mentioned your other vocational work with the consultancy.
Exactly.
So let's hear about that in a second. But
yeah, totally.
So much what you folks do is about maximizing team performance. And in particular, what you call swarm teams, a kind of ad hoc team. So maybe tell us a little bit about the work you do and then explain this concept of swarm teams.
Absolutely. So I wear a lot of hats, both in my work as a physician at the University of Southern California at LAC USC, the Emergency Mind Project. And then the third thing is I'm the chief medical officer of the Mission Critical Team Institute. And we exist to, let's see if I can say this correctly. I almost never get it out because it's a little bit alliterative, but we exist to improve the success, survivability, and sustainability of mission critical teams, which are small groups of folks that operate in life or limb-threatening environments that tend to last 500 seconds or less. Really high stakes, really high, changing, rapidly adaptive problem sets. I got through all those three S's in one swoop, so I feel pretty good about that. Thanks. But yeah, so one of the big things that we work on across, that really cuts across all of these different domains is thinking about how swarm teams work. And there's a good chance, even if you've never heard the word swarm teams, that if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably worked in or around one of them already, even if you weren't necessarily aware of it as a separate entity. And so swarm teams are groups of people that exist off in the wilderness doing some other job. There's a problem that arises. They self-assemble into a unit, converge on the problem set, attack the problem set, and then when they fix it, they go back to their normal environment away from that universe. So they don't exist as a concrete thing. And so really, probably the easiest way to talk about them is to create a dichotomy between them and what you'd call an intact team. So an intact team would be a basketball team or a sports team, for example, right? These folks are selected to serve on that team. They work with each other, they train together, they practice together, they perform together. The team stays constant throughout an operation cycle, which you could think of as like pre-game, the game, and then post-game. They go back afterwards, they try to get better for the next cycle. They go to barbecues together, they hang out when they're not at work. They're like an entity that has things that exist outside of that space. The opposite of that would be a swarm team, which is what we talked about. They assemble only ad hoc for a given problem set and then disappear back into the wilderness of their normal lives afterwards. So in medicine, the typical example would be like a code blue response team, right? These are folks that do other things throughout the hospital. A code is called, they assemble on the problem set, and then they go back to wherever they were afterwards.
Yeah, that's perfect description. And in fact, I think as an example that I think is really utile for this conversation is the trauma team. Because that's something the emergency medicine folks are dealing with, if not in their current situation, because maybe they're not a high-level trauma center, certainly during their training. Everyone can remember back, all of a sudden, in addition to the 5 or 6 people from emergency medicine, you get a group of between 5 and 20, depending on the hospital, people from other services coming down. And you're expected to deal with one of the sickest patients in the hospital with a team that hasn't trained together. And with a host of other problems that I think are unique to medicine, one of them being ambiguity of leadership. And from all the work you've done in the various venues, how should that be optimized?
So this is a really interesting place to get into because I think that things like trauma teams are a separate thing that is not an intact team or a swarm team. I actually think it's a third thing that we're working on. So let me explain that a little bit. When you have an intact team, like I said, everybody knows each other. You have these existing relationships within the network, and those relationships transcend multiple different operations, however you define that. In a swarm team, you basically know nobody and you assemble the team from individual components. A trauma team is a little bit different, right? Really, you're talking about two intact teams that smash together on a non-intact surface. So you have your ER team, and maybe you've been running that shift for 10 hours already. You know the nurses, you know the other doctors in the ER. And then you have a trauma team, and those folks know each other. They've been on 24-hour call or something like that. And then you smash these two units together at this interface. So I actually think that's a third thing that has its own sort of strengths, weaknesses, and needs to work on, as opposed to a code blue team, which would be maybe more like a swarm team environment. And you can create this spectrum of, if you imagine intact teams as solid and swarm teams as liquid, then the middle is like Jello, like a Jello team, a semi-solid team, right? So there's some, in all honesty, there's a little bit of resistance in the groups I work with about calling things Jello teams because it doesn't sound quite tough enough. I'm open to suggestions. Is it lava? Somebody suggested quicksand. I don't know. These are a little bit weird, but in any case, like it's something where it's a little bit different between either of those things. And truthfully, if you look at the diversity of experience among emergency providers across the US and really across the world, we probably spend some times in all three of these camps, depending on how and when we're working. At least for me, when I was coming up, the training set that I got, the mental model set, the cards I had to play, all of that stuff was a little bit about swarm teams, but it was mostly for leadership of intact teams, because frankly, that's what we know the most about. We know very little in a lot of ways about leading swarm teams well and about leading these other Jello teams, for lack of a better word. So I think there's a lot to say about that. But I don't know, how does that strike you? Does that make sense as a concept?
Yeah, it seems fair to divide them into three. And I'm curious to hear optimization of each of them if you're willing to go down that path. You've put out as the code team, as a swarm team. What are the ways that could be made most potent for performance? What do you recommend for swarm teams?
The biggest thing for me when you're thinking about leading swarm teams is the idea that the game starts before the team assembles and it lasts after the team has gone away, which is a frame shift. Because usually when we think about leadership under pressure, we think about those moments of doing it. And if we're supposing we're working in a swarm team where we don't know anybody that's there, it's a little bit weird to say it starts before and it ends afterwards. But I think that's worth a lot of thought. When you have an intact team, the way that you communicate, the way that you operate has a lot to do with personal relationships, right? So you and I know each other. We're going to do a thing together. And I know how you are likely to respond to something because we've done things before. I'm able to anticipate your movements. I'm able to think about that. I don't have that luxury if you and I have never met before, if we're on a swarm team. To get around that, we have to put more stock. We have to put less stock in the personal relationship and more stock in the structure and the role relationship. So it's less important that Dan knows Scott, and it's more important that, let's call it, anesthesia knows ER. Somebody from anesthesia has been in that role every time. Somebody from ER has been in this role every time. And we've agreed to ourselves, oh, this is the standard of action that we can expect from each of these people. So the better we're able to, and this is the before the assembly phase, right? The better we're able to explore what those roles should be and what those relationships should be, the more knowledge we have going in about what we're supposed to do and what we're supposed to expect. And that really requires proactive thinking. Oh, okay, if we're going to assemble a swarm team on a problem set, what should that swarm team look like? What should the person in the red shirt be doing versus the person in the blue shirt be doing? Does everybody understand that? What are the standard operating procedures we're going to do to communicate with each other about that? If you've ever had this is going to sound ironic, but I actually mean it like true. If you've ever had the pleasure of working with a brand new medical student and watching them present something for the first time, and they're trying so hard and you see the joy on their faces and everything, and you watch them tell the vitals of a patient and they're like, the diastolic blood pressure is 79 and the heart rate is 120. And you're like, what are you like? You haven't assembled this in the way that I'm used to hearing it, but that's because they don't know, right? And this is going to come back in a second, but not only understanding the roles, but understanding the ways in which people are primed to receive and pass information to each other, right? The ways that we're able to make those exchanges is super important to run the actual swarm team well. I would also argue on the other end of it that if part of our job as a swarm team is to be better at swarming tomorrow than we are today, then that there's a responsibility to learn from what happens in that moment. That is really hard when nobody technically owns the team, right? Because the team disappears back to their environments. So you also have to have a way that these groups can capture the learning and not waste the suffering of what the team went through in order to build that back. So you have to have these individual team feedback loops that transcend teams, that communicate with each other. There's a lot of moving parts we're talking about here.
I love all of that. That was really interesting. My friends at the Alford down in Australia have their ECMO resuscitations done by what is in essence, by your description, a swarm team. And what they've done is they've created role cards, and on the front of the card is the role of the person, cannulator, assistant. And on the back is the actual responsibilities and expectations of that role, so that the people joining an ad hoc or swarm team actually can, for the minutes in preparation for that event, reestablish in their own minds, these are my roles and this is the responsibilities of that role. Is that kind of getting towards what you're speaking about, Dan?
Yeah, I love that, because to me, that says this team has put a lot of thought into how they expect a swarm team to run, what they think the problem set might be, and what people's starting skill sets are going to be when they enter into that space. I think that's a great way to get some of that, to capture some of those features. Maybe this is a good time to break this down. I tend to think about this like a loop, right? There's the pre-phase or the existing ready state. There's the phase of assembly where a problem has been defined, or at least partly defined, and the swarm team is swarming, for lack of a better word. The operational phase where they attack that problem set, and then the dissolving phase where they go back into wherever they were. And you can think about that as a cycle, right? So ready, assemble, operate, disassemble. Or what I think is maybe more accurate is you think about it like a spiral, because you don't really end up back where you started. You technically end up somewhere else that is just the ability to assemble again on some other problem set. And what you're describing about having roll cards and having things put together is really ready phase work, right? This is stuff that happens before you're actually swarming. You are saying, okay, this is what we think is going to happen when we assemble. It's going to look like this. You're going to have this card. You're going to do this work. And then it's expected that you fill those roles when you get into the room.
I love it. I think you could overlay a framework that you've spoken about that I really love, which is the prepare, perform, recover, and evolve. And that, most of the times I've heard you speak about it, it's been at an individual level, but are you applying the same framework to teamwork and swarm teams and intact teams? Is that same framework overlaid?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think that's a little bit about what that is, Dan.
Sure. So there's two sort of conceptual models that we use a lot in the Emergency Mind Project to think about elite level performance. And one is this thing that you just mentioned, the prepare, perform, recover, and evolve framework, which is a cycle. And basically says when you start thinking about high performance, when I started thinking about it, I was really myopically focused on the actual moment of performance, right? If you've ever put in a central line, you're trying to thread this thing through this other thing and it's super tight and you're really just like all involved in that. But in order to actually be good in that moment, there's all this other stuff that has to happen, right? So preparation is pretty obvious. It's the stuff that you do before that. It's the training, mental and physical, that allows you to execute. It's also all of the stuff that you do before you even start your shift to empower you to do the work. Kristen Holmes, who's the VP of Human Performance for Whoop and a former USA field hockey coach, likes to say, what you do in your off days enables you to perform in your on days. Right? It's all the decisions you make before you actually show up at work. Performance is pretty self-explanatory. It's the moment of performance, handling the stress and pressure. And I think when we switch gears and get into more of the individual stuff, I'm hoping we can dig into some of these concepts as well. Recovery is coming down from the chaos of a situation, making sure that you're buffering the stress and pressure and being able to return to your steady state. And then evolution is sitting down and wondering, what just happened? How am I going to get better at this tomorrow than I am today? And that cycle, to me, carries us through an operational unit, whatever that operation might be. Yes, I think applying that in the team space or the swarm team space is a very parallel problem set, right? Your preparation is maybe this ready state. Your performance actually probably bridges some of assemble, operate, and disassemble. Your recovery is probably disassemble into back to ready, and then your evolution has to happen somewhere in there. And that's a bit of a moving target.
Yeah, I think, and the reason I ask is because I think in most swarm teams, and perhaps in the intact teams in a lot of emergency medicine, the recover and evolve just doesn't occur.
Sure.
They don't take the emotional valence of the room. There's not a hot debrief or a hot wash. And people are just left to dissemble back to their job, but they're not. They're still in a state of emotional frailty, potentially, depending on how things went. And I just don't think it's given enough space in especially in swarm teams. I've gone to many horrible codes, and the people are like, all right, I guess we'll just go back to our job with something like a 6-year-old resuscitation that didn't go well. And it's not right.
Yeah, there's this sort of, and not in a good way, right? There's this sort of like mic drop moment where you do the thing and you're like, okay, cool. Okay, great. And then you wander back and you're like, what the hell just happened? And not only that, but there's this re-entry phenomenon. We talk a lot in the Mission Critical Team Institute about rituals and thresholds, because I think there's not a lot of attention paid to that sort of a thing like there should be. You are a person who's on a swarm team, you're activated, you go to solve a problem set, and let's say it doesn't work. You're in this incredibly high emotionally stressed moment. And then you turn around and you go back to your normal space and everybody else has been doing their normal thing, right? I think we all felt some version of this in medicine on and off during the COVID pandemic, right? We would go to a shift and it would be life or death over and over again. And then you'd go home and the people that weren't in medicine were talking about their Zoom meetings. And you're like, man, there's this incredible reentry phenomenon. Like, how do you actually come back and do that? And I don't think we do that. If I could design swarm team operation principles from the ground up, which we're working on, by the way, let's say hypothetically, I had that ready to go right now. One of the things I would definitely put in this concept of what can the team back home do to reabsorb the person that has just gone and swarmed? What can the individual who is swarming do to successfully reenter their home team?
Yes. I love that so much. It makes me think of a couple of things. One is that my coaching partner, Rob Orman, and I, one of the protocols we developed are boundary rituals for that transition zone, that liminal space between being on shift and going back into your home. And we actually have people stop in the driveway or garage, and we actually have a ritual that we'd like people to do to make that transition real, to actually externalize the transition between these two radically different spaces. And then it's so funny because you speak about this stuff on the team level and I speak on the individual level in so much of what we do. But one of the Mind of the Resuscitation episode was specifically on the steps you need to take after a difficult resuscitation, when an adrenaline dump and all of the emotions flying around, and just going back to start seeing back pain patients is not the right way to play it. And that's, I guess, in essence, another boundary ritual that I was approaching on the individual level. And you're speaking, Dan, about it on the team level. And I love that.
So I think that's a really important distinction, because I think both are important. Right? Like both the individual and the team components are really important for that. So there's a couple of players in there, right? So one is the person who's going back and forth between the swarm team and whatever they otherwise do, which I'll call the home team for lack of a better word for it. And then there's both of those teams. There's the swarm team and the home team. So what should the swarm team do when it's disassembling? How do you disassemble a swarm team? Okay, the person who's going back, what should they do to cross that boundary? And then the home team that's about to recapture their operator, what should that team do to really make reentry successful? And honestly, to learn from that experience. What would this ideally look like? Okay, you've got a group that disassembles and they debrief and they plan what to do better next time. They go through their own boundary rituals. They come back to the home team and they teach. And they train and they learn, and the home team welcomes them and celebrates that experience, however it went. One working model of this is something that some of the EOD, the explosive ordnance disposal teams do. So one of the ways that they run this is when you're coming off of an operational engagement, sometimes you are immediately reassigned to do sim training for the next group that's about to spin up. So that's a really interesting way at a team and organizational level to dictate individual behavior that says, we're going to help you facilitate that transition and help you learn from what happened.
It's brilliant. Medicine just has reversed entirely the time devoted to training versus performance. And something like that seems almost laughable, right? To imagine fitting and yet so necessary for high level performance is it's incorporating that ability to teach what you've learned from hard-won experience. And I just don't see that loop being there as much as it needs to be in medicine. Dan, we've discussed swarm teams a little bit. Let's discuss this concept of what you're calling a Jello team or a smash team.
Yeah. Smash team. Yeah, I like that. That's tougher than Jello team.
So you have two team structures being smashed together. It is in fact, one of the few frustrations I have in medicine comes when I'm in situations where there's an ambiguity and potentially even fight for leadership. Mm-hmm. I'm happy to be a follower. I have no problem with it at all. I find it very disturbing when the situation is not clear as to who the leader should be. And then if there's a leadership vacuum, I think that's really leads the patient to suffer poor performance in their resuscitation. And there's all these conflicts of culture as well. So how do you think about this? And do you have any possible solutions?
So I mentioned earlier that there are two large-scale algorithms or structures that we use to think about stuff in the Emergency Mind Project. The first is that PRE loop, the prepare, perform, recover, evolve loop. The second is this thing that's called the ITSO matrix, ITSO, right? And imagine a 3x2 matrix for this. The rows of this matrix are the levels of organization. So individual level, team level, and then organizational level. And the columns are on or off the target, on or off the X. Right? Where X is whatever this high stakes operation is you're doing. So a lot of the time we talk about individual level stuff. Some of the time we talk about team level stuff, and rarely do we talk about actually organizational or structural level stuff. But I think that to run a Jello team or a Smash team, you have to really leverage this organizational level, the structural level of organization, something that supersedes and goes beyond the teams. Because at that team interface, so you have a couple things. You have the problems of the actual interface, like how are these teams communicating with each other? Then you have the larger scale things of how should these teams be operating with each other? And the question you're getting to of who runs a room when you have one of these teams actually spans all of this, right? It spans the structural level, who should be doing it, the team level, who's actually doing it when you're communicating, and the individual level of who has the ability to actually run that team. Is the person in that role capable of doing the thing they're supposed to be doing, and are they actually getting it done? So I think you have to look at it from the lens of this whole structure in order to figure out what the problems are around that. And I would imagine all of us have examples in our mind about Jello team assemblies that work really well, where you're like that, you see your counterpart's name on the list that day and you're like, yeah, that's the trauma team I love working with. And other ones where you're like, okay, like we can manage this, but it's not necessarily my preference. So what is it that makes those sort of setups different? Right. And I don't know.
First of all, I think you're at a disadvantage here because you have the team at USC for these trauma teams, and you have folks like Kenji Inaba and the culture that they've indoctrinated. So I don't think you
totally
get to
amazing.
see the true horrors of what it's like to have a service come down to your own geography, the one that has built into your mind. This is our place. We know how things work. Our nurses are an intact team for the most part, and have poor communication, in some cases, poor clinical judgment. We in emergency medicine should not presume that we know what to do in the operating room, but we're pretty damn good at understanding how to resuscitate a trauma patient in the first 30 minutes. And when you see things that are just not gelling with your personal practice, but clear evidence is saying this is not a good move. Like the trauma surgeon that wants to give the third liter of crystalloid to an exsanguinating patient. Like we know at this stage, like even their own 10 years behind the curve ATLS has said, don't do this. And you'll have a trauma team leader, because in their mind, they are the leader. And in the United States, for better or for worse, they have the backing of the society that has told them that all trauma is run by the trauma surgeons. And you now are witnessing a patient getting care that is absolutely against evidence. And how to deal with that is, I don't know the right way to do it. Every way I've tried has had some benefits. The patient got the care I wanted, but then I get a call from their chair. So Dan, help me here. Help me solve the problem that places that don't have as an enlightened trauma service might deal with across the country.
So let's take another tack at this. Let's imagine for a moment that somebody listening to this podcast is like, Dan and Scott, here is multi-billion dollars. You start your own emergency department that handles everything. You're going to put it wherever you want. You're going to assemble your team from the ground up. What would we build, right? What do we think the right answer to do this is? And I'll start us off with a little bit of this thought, which is that we'd probably train all of the individuals really well to do their own jobs. Then we would train them laterally. right? We would train them a little bit of cross training with the other sets of teams and say, okay, what is this person really good at? Why does their mind work the way that it does? And let's spend a little bit of time making sure we understand the thought patterns of each other. Then we would do organized regular simulations with both groups where we get people together and we debrief. We create an environment where we are capable of discussing friction and problem sets and saying, oh, why did this happen this way? Because we remember our underlying guiding principle is to provide elite level resuscitation care. And if that's our goal, then that's above any one of our egos and any one of ourselves. But how do you get there? You got to put each other under friction a bunch of times, watch it happen, and create long-standing relationships between groups, even if the players in those groups swap out, right? That allow you to say, we all believe in the mission that we're going under. Then we'd sit down and we put together some really smart policy about what should happen in most cases. And we'd build a system that analyzes what happens when things don't go the way we expect them to. We'd probably adopt a safety 2 framework for this, where we sit down and think about what should happen, what's surprising, what goes the way we think it should or doesn't in positive or negative deviation, and then have joint team reviews about these operations. Okay, I don't know anybody that actually works that way.
So that would be a utopia.
But yeah, that would be really cool. And I would think, although I can't prove it because I don't know if that exists, I would think that team would outperform pretty much anybody that you put them against.
I can't imagine that's not true. Absolutely right. I think the reluctance I see in this particular example, but I'm sure it's extrapolable to others, is in some ways, both services don't want to get rid of that ambiguity because they fear it will not go the direction they want. So if you resolve the leadership ambiguity, okay, trauma's always in charge, or emergency medicine's always in charge, one service is going to be very disappointed. If another role ambiguity that continuously comes up at the centers I visit and speak to of, okay, who gets to do the procedures during the trauma? Now this clearly is something like in any organizational structure would be worked out ahead of time, would never be being figured out in the moment. You just say, okay, on alternate days, it goes emergency medicine or trauma. These are easily soluble. And yet in many centers, because they don't want to get that ambiguity worked out, because in their minds, we will, in the game theory, we'll do better if our personalities could simply force what we want to happen in real time versus having it figured out. And so much of it's, obviously would be fixed by the utopia you envision, but it also could be fixed simply by having an agreement of things and hammering this stuff out. But in many cases, doing that is going to be at someone's detriment. What do you think about that?
I think we're talking in some sense about culture here. We're talking about culture, trust, and mission, which aren't things we normally talk about because normally we talk about like resuscitation and blood pressure and things, but really culture, trust, and mission.
Yeah, I buy all of that. It just comes back to, if the perception is these are two separate teams, then a lot of these things will arise. In places that work, USC being an example, shock trauma, and a few other places that are notable because they're usually the exceptions, the culture is that the two services are a single team. And then so much of this falls away. You don't have competition between services. You have teamwork. And I think that's really what's lacking, is the combining of two services into one team.
Right. So let's say that's our goal, right? To combine services together and make sure the mission is more important. What would it look like if we believed that? Right. I'm sitting here. One of the books I have behind me here is Atomic Habits by James Clear. Right. So Clear says habits are a vote for who you are. The things that you do on a day-to-day basis are a vote for who you are and who you want to be. Okay, if we believed our job is to smash teams together effectively to create high-performance hybrids, right? Patent pending, high-performance hybrids.
Yes.
What are the habits that we would do to achieve that goal? What are the things we would do? Probably one thing we would not do is continue to make jokes about how much the other team sucked. We would stop saying those damn trauma people are always trying to do whatever, or ER doctors aren't as smart as other people. So I trained at Mass General, which is you could throw a rock and hit a brilliant people like on every bounce of that rock before it hit the ground. And I remember going as an EM intern during residency to the ICU on an away rotation. Really excited. The Mass General ICU. Wow, this is the place. And they had a big sort of a faceplate thing on the wall where they had all of the pictures of all of the people in that month period. And it was, here's the senior, here's the junior, here's the off-service intern. And then instead of me, they had an empty box that said ER intern. And I was like, that probably didn't need to happen. Does that matter in the grand scheme of things? No, there were more important things to do in Mass General than putting my face on a piece of paper. But at the same time, if we want to build this universe, those little habits really make a big difference, right? So I went in and drew a little stick figure and put a smile on it and drew a little speech bubble that said, I love emergency. And made that my thing, right? And put an exclamation point next to my name anytime it came up in a thing, just to be like, guys, I'm here. Like, I'm part of this. But it shouldn't have had to be me that did that. Can we smooth the way over for that? Can we stop making this divide bigger than it is? Pema Chodron, the Buddhist monk, says this amazing thing, which is just don't pour gas on the fire. That's a great way to start. Just don't pour gas on it, right? That's like, you don't have to have the utopia from that. Just think to your team when you're talking, guys, is this the habit that we want to have? Is this the universe we want to be building? That's easy.
That's fantastic. We've discussed 2 team types. Let's finish off with the third. And intact teams, it sounds like a great thing. You could cross-train with your actual team members. You can learn their ways of handling things. You can make a clear pattern of communication that's consistent. And yet, I don't see any intact team behavior in emergency medicine, especially post-COVID, but even beforehand. It seems, even though we should be an intact team, most of the time it's a swarm team. I find more similarities with swarm teams than intact teams in emergency medicine. You could get a 20-year veteran nurse who knows everything and you've worked with so often that you don't even have to speak. You guys could read each other's minds. And then on the next day, you might have a nurse that has never done a resuscitation at any point. And I think it's what we're going to talk about in the second part of this podcast. But tell me a little bit about what should be going into forming the intact teams in emergency medicine such that we yield all the benefits of that.
I'll preface this by saying that I don't run intact teams most of the time, right? I run swarm teams, I run Jello smash teams, but I don't really run intact teams because of the way most of the places that I work actually operate, with the exception of actually the Mission Critical Team Institute itself, which is an intact team in and of itself when we do an operation or we do a training. So I actually think I'm probably the least skilled at leading that type of a team. My vision of it from speaking to a bunch of groups and working with a bunch of groups is that there is such importance on the long-term relationships that happen in there. And again, to think about the James Clear idea, habits are a vote for who you are. When you're having these interactions with each other, whether it's in the middle of an intense situation or not, the way that you decide to act, the way that you carry yourself as a human being, echoes through all of the rest of the instances of this. So one thing as an example of this that I'm working with a lot of my juniors on, and really not really my cusp juniors, right? These are folks that are about to be seniors and are starting to lead, is they're just at the point where they're starting to understand stuff really deeply. And a nurse might come into them and say, can we do this? Or I'm worried about this. And you'll watch them be like, no thanks, and go to the next thing. And I'm like, you're correct. That didn't need to happen, but that person's going to remember the way that you interacted with them. And every moment that you're interacting with somebody is an opportunity to either make the team better or make the team worse. And if you really believe that, then you should take the time in those moments to be like, you know what? Why do you think that? Talk to me about what you're understanding. How can we build this together? You want to be the rising tide that lifts all of the ships in that team. If you don't have the moment, the time in that exact moment to have that conversation, that's fine, because a lot of what we do doesn't have time and space for that. But you can very easily say, you know what? We're going to do it this way. That's a great question. Come back to me later. We're going to explain it. And then you better go explain it to that person, right? Because they're watching and they're learning about what type of a team player and a human being you are. That type of thing, which does blur the line a little bit between intact teams and swarm teams, is really important in both of those cases, but also really important in those intact teams.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It brings up another coaching protocol we have. We created this idea of flow games, these things you could practice for one shift at a time, just to change the dynamic to one of play, of flow enhancement. You get that from just having an overarching concept for that shift, the kind of game you're playing. And one of them is embodied metta, the Buddhist concept of wishing goodwill to the world. But we do a flow game called embodied metta, where instead of just wishing it, you actually leave each person for that shift, each person's interaction, you leave them better off than they were before they spoke with you. And yeah, that's exactly it because we get silly questions all the time. But for that person, the question is not silly. They're putting themselves out there or evoking curiosity or trying to contribute, and to be smashed down is just the worst feeling in the world. We've all felt it when we were trainees, and it's just not embracing of team building. You say you don't have much experience, but you're, by all reports, fantastic emergency physician. And so you have these nurses that you worked with for how many years have you been at USC?
Yeah. 6-ish, something like that.
You have built a rapport and a knowledge, and you do so much this work outside of emergency medicine that just is giving you all these ideas and ways for optimal performance. What have you brought back to USC in terms of creating an intact team, in terms of training with your team? What have you brought back? And then the second part of that question is, if you had that magic wand and could really do anything you wanted there, what would you do that you're not doing now?
Sure. So there's an underlying thought that I wonder if I'm making up hearing that question, or if it was actually what you meant. And the underlying thought is that maybe intact teams would be better than swarm teams.
That is my assumption. Am I wrong about that?
Oh yeah. I don't know if that's true.
Oh,
right. I think they're different things. I think one's a wrench and one's a screwdriver.
I would not have thought that. Okay, well then go into that a little bit, and then you can answer those questions with that new understanding.
What are some of the advantages of a swarm team or a liquid team? It's incredibly agile. It allows you to distribute force, energy, and resources where and when they're needed most. It increases the surface area of contacts between like scarce resources and where you need them to be. And it actually has the potential to increase learning through your entire organization, right? So if you have one person from each floor who assembles on a swarm team to run a code, those 5 people that are in that room learn something. But if you operate it, they actually go back and teach every unit how to run a code better. That's amazing, right? If you had only the same 5 people every time, that would get that 5-person squad way better. But I'm not actually sure that would necessarily make your organization better in the same way. So I don't actually think that it's necessarily a better or a worse thing. I think they're just different.
I'm going to finally push back against something.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
You've given it very clean-cut dichotomy that I agree with you on. Yeah, it's certainly better if you had only 5 people who always work together versus...
Sure.
But the real question is, would the performance be better with 4 people who always work together and have developed a rapport, a capability of nonverbal communication in anticipation of necessity because of cross-training, and therefore you know what the nurses need and how to communicate with them, and they know what you need, and your colleagues and assistants the same. And then you brought in 1 or 2 people that are not part of that intact team, so that there is that capability of spreading that. Well, which team is going to have a higher performance? The intact team plus 2 additional members who are just there really for their learning value and to spread it, or a pure swarm team? And I'd have to say the former is going to perform better.
Yeah, you're probably right across most problem sets. I wonder about the really rapidly changing problem sets that are maybe different or outside of our normal sort of experience. Most cardiac arrests are actually there's not quite as much uncertainty around them as we tend to think there are, right? There's only a couple pathways. You do your stuff, you have your protocols for that. I wonder about if you turn back in time to and I don't know the answer to this. I'm literally wondering out loud. If you turn back in time to the beginning of COVID, when all of a sudden you had all these patients that were really not responding the way that we'd expected them to respond, where the uncertainty level was really ratcheted up, I'm actually not sure who does better in those moments, right? And so you could imagine, for instance, a different team configuration, what the McChrystal group calls a fusion cell, which is suddenly flattening hierarchy by bringing a lot of people from different units together at the same point in time and then distributing back to their teams and having this almost like yo-yo sort of effect. And that seems to work really well for a lot of the operations they did overseas. But I'm not sure. You're probably right on most cases. The more intact, the better. But it's worth thinking about, is that always true? And is that true for where you're operating?
Yeah, I hear you. An empirical example, I run codes up on the floor. I'll go and just to lend a hand, and sometimes I'll wind up taking over code leadership, and then I'll run codes in my unit. And the performance level is dramatically higher in the unit. Now, part of that, of course, is going to be equipment familiarity and just established ways of doing things. But part of it is also that the nurses in our resus cadre know exactly how we like to run codes.
Yeah.
And just having one of them is a dramatic difference in performance. And I would take a swarm team with one doctor and one nurse who work together in the same vernacular and think really can be a force multiplier for performance in that situation than a pure swarm team.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. I would also choose that team to resuscitate me almost all of the time.
But I hear you that adding chaos to the system oftentimes will lead to further evolution that wouldn't be there if you're always working with the same set of people who have really bred the same mindset. And
it can.
Yeah. So I agree with you.
And if you think about that, like where does, just continue this idea about basketball for a super intact team, like that 5-person squad is able to win, plus the other people is able to win a championship. But what happens 2 years from now? Where does the talent come from that? So in order to maintain that, they have to have this really sophisticated talent development pool that allows them to bring people on and then bring them in one at a time into that group and see what happens to it. So that's not necessarily a totally functional system by itself either. I think it's just worth thinking about that a little bit. In any case, you asked a really good question, which is, what do you know about leading intact teams and how would you design it and what would you do with that? I also think in that case, similar to what we were talking about for the other two team sizes or team styles, that leading from mission and leading from shared values is one of the most important pieces. Right. So if you really believe that it's not just this patient, but also getting better for tomorrow, your intact team is going to function differently. You're going to prioritize different things, right? There might be concrete things you do, who runs this round of CPR? Who does this intubation? It might not always be the person who is most capable of doing the intubation in that exact moment in time, because you have to prepare for tomorrow slightly differently, right? Than if all you were doing was this one operation today. Understanding, making sure everybody is on the same page about what that mission is an incredibly crucial piece of that. Having those longer term relationships and understanding that your job is to develop both the individuals on the team and the team as a whole, probably super important for that. And then having the space where people are able to challenge themselves as individuals and to start to hit that barrier of, what Dave Alred, the rugby coach, would call the ugly zone, where they're getting into the space where things are struggling to work, and maybe they're not quite working all the time. And really that's a whole conversation about psychological safety and a bunch of other stuff like that we don't really have to go into at the second. But those are some general operating principles about that. I don't know, what else would you add to that list?
I wouldn't add anything to the list. It's almost different topic, and it is just in terms of time, the last question I'll be able to ask you. But when I feel like this in an interview, it means that you have to come back, because there's just thousands of additional questions I'd love to talk to you about. Hopefully this will not be the last time. But
absolutely,
to bring it to a really practical level in that intact team, what training would you consider the bare minimum for optimal resuscitation performance that intact team should be doing together? I see SIMs, and oftentimes it's the docs. The residency leadership is training the residents, but there's not a regular setup for team training. And we have not established in emergency medicine what that bare minimum should really be. So what do you think, if you're going to a place and they're asking you, what should be the bare minimum we should do as a team training? What does that come to mind?
This is a good question and worthy of a longer answer that will probably need a couple iterations to really lock in. But off the top of my head, communication, and not just the standard communication about closed loop, although that's a great place to start, right? But we're really talking here about how to communicate in critical moments, how to communicate in routine moments, how to switch between those two, and how to handle friction in critical moments. Inherent in that is the idea of cross-cultural communication. What are the things that you as a doctor want to say to a nurse? What does a nurse want to say to you as a doctor? You got to deal with things about hierarchy here. You got to deal with pushback, all this sort of stuff that actually enables shared mental model formation to happen on the fly. you have to deal with, and then to rely back on this PRE cycle, right? You have to deal with spinning up a team from zero to start with the stuff that happens in that operational moment. And that includes rebounding from failure and overcoming adversity, switching from plan A to plan B, that kind of work. Then you have to deal with coming down. So how to debrief, how to learn effectively, and how to set back up for tomorrow again. So functionally, communication in the actual moment, recovery from mistakes and task switching, and then debriefing across all of the different players that are going to be in the room for that.
That's fantastic. Dan, again, this conversation could go for hours more. And in fact, we're going to have another conversation on your podcast that if
exactly.
people love this one, and I'm sure they will have, then they could come listen to that second part. But I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. And it should have happened way sooner, but I'm happy we've remedied that deficit by having you here.
Scott, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you for having me.
Well, there you go. That was so much fun to speak about. If you want to hear part 2, then just go to the Emergency Mind podcast. You can find the links in the show notes, or you could just search for Emergency Mind podcast on your podcast player of choice, and you will find that second part of this discussion. And it really continued organically, and I think it went to really good places. So they should be a match set. They should not be separated. They will be forlorn. All right. So what else? Well, at the end, I always speak about the physician coaching that I do, and I always try to highlight one particular facet of it. And today, let's talk about behavioral issues. Now, if you got them, you know it is a problem. Now, maybe it's been a problem that's been brought up to you by the administration. Maybe you're worried that is going to happen and you want to stave that off. Maybe you've been told if you don't shape up, that's going to be it. You're going to be axed. You don't want to let that happen. If you have a particular issue, if you don't get along with staff and you think it's them, well, trust me, if you're not getting along with staff a bunch of the time, it's probably you. And we can fix it. We can make it better. So if you're interested in that, come on over to emcrit.org/coaching and we could talk. We could see if we're a good fit and maybe fix some of those issues. All right. This has been Scott Weingart for the EMCrit podcast saying bye-bye.